So, what is your point?
My point is this. I think psychologists are better trained to deal with difficult situations. I believe many are fearful and feel highly restricted in what they are willing to do for their patients. I believe the psychology board is overly focused on controlling psychologists and helping the profession to serve the public wisely.
The psychology board is responsible for protecting the public, not helping psychologists serve the public wisely. We are essentially a law and rule enforcement board.
But what about protecting patients? All this just means that a psychologist is better off doing as little as possible rather than doing something that is not clearly defined by a standard of care.
It is unethical for a psychologist to provide negligent care.
This is interesting. I see many psychologists just stand by and do as little as possible, or pretend like they can't do anything. They take a passive role when they could take a more active role. I see psychologists stand by and do nothing simply because they are afraid there is no right answer that everyone would agree with. Or they don't know what the board would think. Or, maybe there is nobody to consult with. I mean, try to get a hold of your attorney or another psychologist during working hours, on a Friday night, or on a weekend.
That is not the board's problem.
Okay. I am not sure I understand why this is not the board's problem. I mean, can a psychologist decide to do nothing because they could not get a second opinion and they did not know what to do?
That depends on the situation. But psychologists are supposed to act ethically and professionally. The actions of a psychologist and their inaction can be unethical and unprofessional.
Okay. So how does the psychology board define unprofessional behavior?
That is a good question. I don't know. The board is still trying to figure that out. It has become a real problem lately because there is a new law in our state that requires a healthcare professional to report any professional they believe has ever acted unprofessionally. And the law does not define unprofessional.
What happens if you don't report another professional?
You can be prosecuted and lose your license.
Wow. So the term unprofessional is a vague concept to begin with, and is not defined by law. It seems to me that this law is going to make it hard for psychologists to trust each other. And it might be hard for a psychologist to ask for a second opinion. It makes me nervous just thinking that another psychologist might report me if I made an honest mistake.
Have you ever done anything that might be unprofessional?
No. Oh no.
That is hard to believe. Hey, I was just kidding.
Oh. You had me worried. I thought I was in trouble.
Sorry, I was just kidding.
So, is it okay if I ask more questions?
Sure.
So what happens after a person or a patient sends you a complaint?
Our board investigator reviews the complaint and makes an initial assessment and brings their initial findings in the complaint before the board. We review the complaint and decide if we need more information from the person or from the psychologist. We may decide there was no violation, or we may send a letter to the psychologist asking them to respond to some initial questions. Our board investigator may also interview the psychologist, witnesses, or the person filing the complaint.
Does the psychologist get to see the complaint?
No.
Does the psychologist get to see the evidence that supports the allegations?
No. Not usually. The board provides the psychologist with only a very general overview of the concerns and the issues. If it is a patient, the board may tell the psychologist the name of the patient. If it is not a patient, they may not tell the psychologist the name of that person.
What about patient records?
If the complaint is filed by a patient, then the board will ask the patient for a release to obtain a copy of the records from the psychologist. This can include treatment, administrative and billing records. We do not generally ask for a patient's records if the complaint was not filed by a patient unless the person has a legal right to those records. Those people would be like a parent or guardian of a child who was the patient.
What does the board do with the records?
The investigator reviews the records to see if there is reason to suspect that the psychologist did anything unethical.
Does the board do anything else with the records?
Yes. The board also reviews the records to see if the psychologist has done anything unethical that the person filing the complaint did not think of. The board has the authority to investigate and ask additional questions regarding a psychologist's practice. We can actually start an investigation for something unrelated to the complaint filed by a patient.
So it is basically a fishing expedition.
Sort of. I guess you could say that.
Do you tell the psychologist what you are fishing for? I mean, can they ask?
No. The investigator or the board asks the questions.
So let me see if I get this. The psychologist has to respond to questions without knowing exactly what the board suspects or believes. The psychologist does not get to see the exact allegations and the evidence that was provided to the board. And so the psychologist has no way to challenge evidence or allegations. Nor can they know what evidence to submit that would refute information that the board is keeping secret.
That is correct. But it is not a secret. We just don't want the psychologist to have it.
You said earlier that the board sends a letter outlining the concerns and issues in the complaint. What happens after the psychologist responds to the initial letter from the board?
The board investigator may next decide to interview the psychologist. Or they may request additional evidence from the psychologist to prove they may have acted unethically.
Just to be sure I understand. You're telling me that the investigator interviews the psychologist and the psychologist may not know exactly why the investigator is asking for evidence and answers to questions.
That is true. They are told in a general way what the concerns are.
It sounds like the psychologist could be forced to incriminate theirself. Your process seems like it could increase the risk that a psychologist could accidentally mislead the board. What if the psychologist refuses to answer a question, or he or she does not feel they can answer a question without potentially misleading the investigator?
They must cooperate with the investigator or the psychologist will be disciplined for refusing to cooperate. In that case, the board may assume the allegations are correct.
How does the process ensure that the psychologist has enough information to provide a good answer or the right evidence? I mean, how can anyone know how to respond fully if he or she has not seen the evidence and does not know the exact allegations?
This is the process we use. Do you have another question?
When does the psychologist get to see the complaint and the evidence against him or her?
Well, the psychologist can only see the evidence until after they have been found guilty of unethical behavior. Not before.
Why are you smiling?
Was I?
Yes. Never mind. So what happens next?
The board decides whether or not they want to initiate a formal investigation. They can drop the matter and send a dismissal or an advisory letter to the psychologist. If they feel there are sufficient grounds, the board will send what we call a 30-day letter summarizing the allegations and requesting the psychologist respond with 30 days. This means a formal investigation has been initiated by the board. The psychologist must respond to the board's questions in writing within 30 days.
So first the board investigates and the psychologist has to respond even though they may not know what the allegations are. Then the board decides if there are sufficient grounds to suggest that the psychologist was unethical. At this point, does the psychologist get to see the complaint, the evidence submitted, or the exact nature of the allegations?
Yes. But they still do not get to see all the evidence or the basis of the complaint.
Why do you keep information and evidence from the psychologist?
Because we want to protect the patient and the public.
You've said that. But I don't see how that protects the public. Why don't you simply provide the information so the psychologist can properly defend theirself?
Because we don't want to give them the information. We are here to protect the public and person filing the complaint, not the psychologist.
Wow. So what happens next?
The psychologist responds to what we believe they may have done. We tell them what ethical principles and standard of care they may have violated. The board may also decide to interview the psychologist in person. In that case, the psychologist comes and testifies before the board. A member of the board interviews the psychologist in front of the board.
How long is the interview?
The interview takes about 20 minutes.
What is that like? I mean, what happens?
The psychologist comes to our board meeting.
Is this a conversation? Or what happens?
It is really an examination, not a conversation. The psychologist is examined by a board member.
You said the examination is about 20 minutes? That is not long. Does the psychologist get to ask questions?
No. Well, they can ask the examiner to restate or to clarify the questions. But the psychologist is not allowed to ask any questions about the evidence or reason behind the questions.
Is the psychologist allowed to have anyone present?
Only his or her attorney.
Can his attorney ask questions?
No. The attorney cannot ask questions.
So you can examine the psychologist, but the psychologist cannot be cross-examined by his or her attorney.
No. The attorney can make comments and help clarify questions. But the board asks the questions. The board decides the process.
So there is no cross-examination. There is no discussion of evidence. I'm really confused. How does the psychologist defend him or herself against allegations and evidence they are not allowed to see or know?
The board gives them a chance to say anything they want after direct examination.
How much time does the psychologist have?
Around 5 minutes.
5 minutes? That is not very much time. So the psychologist must defend theirself in 5 minutes. Wow. It seems like the examination is really stacked against the psychologist. It sounds like the board is focused on proving guilt and not finding the truth.
Dr. Friendly, the board is here to protect the public, not the psychologist. The psychologist must prove they are not guilty.
Wow. Can the psychologist bring witnesses to testify regarding what happened?
No. We do not allow witnesses. Our investigator has interviewed all the witnesses we are interested in talking to.
Does the psychologist get to know who you have interviewed?
No.
What happens after the inquisition? I'm sorry. Examination.
The board meets and determines if the psychologist is guilty of violating any ethical principles in the code of conduct.
I'm confused. I think I keep missing something. So the psychologist does not get to review the evidence or know exactly what they are accused of doing. Can the psychologist ask the board what the reasoning is behind their questions? I mean, if they are confused?
No. Is it not a conversation?
What happens next? After the examination?